What a breath of fresh air. We thank Matt and his team. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Seth Lynn, our next speaker from the Center for Second Service. And as I think you know, the Center for Second Service is trying to encourage returned vets to run for public office. And I think the statistics that we've probably all seen is that there's a declining number of members of the Senate and the House, for example, who have military service. I think Senator Metzenbaum was the last survivor of World War II to be a member of the U.S. Congress. So the work that Seth and his team and his organization are doing, I think, deserve the attention and respect and support of all of us. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Seth Lynn to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Just listening to Matt's words in the green room a second ago, and I'm happy to be following him because he really set the tone for what I wanted to talk about. Is my presentation coming up? I hope we haven't gotten death by PowerPoint. We just want to stop it for the rest of the day because I actually have some pretty good visuals I wanted to show you. Is that coming up? All right, well, I'll just start anyway. I'm Seth Lynn. I'm the director of the Center for Second Service, which, as you just heard, is an organization dedicated to getting veterans involved civically. It really began as through politics, just getting veterans involved in politics and running for office, and it's grown since then. It began a while ago. I was still in the Marine Corps at the time, it was about 6 years ago now, and I always heard my boss, who's been in the Marine Corps for 26 years, about to retire, and he always would say, you know, back in the day there used to be a lot more veterans in Congress, and it was so much better back then, and I thought it was one of these stories that you always hear from the old guys about how things were so much better back in the day. But I actually began studying this a couple of years later, and in a second you're going to see this great-looking graph that'll show you how many veterans there were in the end of the Vietnam War, and then how it's been declining steadily since then to nowadays when we have just around 20%. So that kind of got me started with this idea that I really should do something about this. Oh, there we go. Okay. Go to the next slide, please. And do I have a clicker here? I'm sorry. Oh, right here. Okay, great. I'm just gonna. Is that? Yeah, that's the laser. I'm sorry about this. I should have definitely gotten a better practice there. Okay, there's that graph I was telling you about. And you can see sort of how it's declined since then. So I began this organization as a grad student thinking, you know, I served a lot of people who would make fantastic elected officials but have no idea about politics. The trouble was I didn't know anything about politics either. I'd studied political science at the Naval Academy and been in the Marine Corps for 6 years. That didn't really help. Luckily, I could grab some friends around me who were all going to grad school together at Princeton and said, hey, you know, can you help me with this? You worked on campaigns. You were a campaign manager. You ran at some point. And they all wanted to help out, whether or not they had any military service themselves, which was really inspiring for me. And this grew over the time. It's been a real whirlwind for the last few years. But we're now called the Center for Second Service here at the George Washington University. And I'll tell you a little bit about our programs in a bit. But one thing I've also gotten to do as of last semester is be an adjunct professor of legislative affairs and teach a course in civil-military relations. And people always say, you know, you learn more from your students than you teach. And I was like, yeah, people say that. But in my case, I mean, part because I'm a Marine, but it was definitely true. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things that they were able to study for the last semester that really have a lot to do with what we're talking about and what Matt was really talking about in the last segment. So the first story I just want to tell you about is about 100 years ago, and it'd be hard to believe that this actually happened 100 years ago. To the right there, well, to the left first of all, is obviously women's suffrage. That happened in 1920, and to the right you have General Truscott, who was a hero of World War II. He commanded the 15th Army, the 5th Army, and then after the war he took over the 3rd Army for General Patton. If you remember the Patton movie, he was featured in that. But in 1923, he and his wife Sarah were arriving at Camp Marfa, Texas, with the 1st Cavalry Division and doing a rotation out there. And It's important to consider at the time, this is almost like you could be considered overseas voting today, because this was not just going to a garrison in Texas. This was actually a frontier where they were concerned about Mexican revolutionaries coming into Texas. It had happened. Pancho Villa had done a few raids. And so it was almost like an overseas deployment. But what's interesting is at first, town-gown relations were pretty good, but there were 10,000 people in the town. And like most southern towns at the time, Marfa was 100% Democrats. And it split almost evenly between a conservative and a liberal faction. And the liberal faction would spend more time on post, and the conservative faction apparently tended to not appreciate the bridge playing and the cocktail parties and the dances that they have on post, and so they kind of stayed away. Well, as I mentioned, the 21st Amendment had just been ratified 3 years earlier. So the liberal candidate and his wife together were able to use that to their advantage. The only proper record of what happened is from General Truscott's memoirs and interviews he did later in life. But what I found fascinating is at the time, Texas law prohibited voting by felons, insane persons, and regular members of the U.S. Army. And can you imagine what would happen in Austin if they tried to pass a law like that now? So it's kind of amazing how sort of we're sitting here today and thinking about that was less than 100 years ago. So anyway, Captain Truscott, was a good soldier, followed orders and so forth. And so he spent the morning of the election, or the primary, at the rifle range. And he came back at noon, and his wife Sarah had put together lunch for him. And she said, "Guess what? I voted." And this was apparently, later he talked about how mortified he was. And he said, you what? And she said, "I voted." And she talked about how the liberal candidate had, his wife had come onto post and gathered a bunch of her friends and take them all out to vote in town. And, she was all excited, and she said, "Why don't you give me a cigar?" And he was, of course, hugely mortified that his wife would go out and vote, because this just wasn't done at the time. So when the election was done, when the primary was over, the liberal candidate had won by such a thin margin that it was obvious that the officers' wives had been a determining factor in that election. So a huge uproar ensues at this point. And the losing candidate is appealing to both the state authorities and the commanding general of the division, saying this is not right. And so the general brings in all his officers and berates them for allowing their wives to vote. You can imagine how that would go over today, too. And eventually, they appealed to the state authorities. The state authorities said, well, these officers weren't residents of Marfa, so their wives couldn't legally vote there either, and they ended up overturning the election. So that is something that happened in the state of Texas less than 100 years ago. I found that when 3 of my students actually did a project on this, I found it pretty fascinating that actually happened. As I said, the class I was teaching was in civil military relations and politics. And the question of civil military relations over history has really been about how do you keep Rome safe? How is the military strong enough to keep Rome safe without letting Caesar cross the Rubicon? How do you give your military enough power to adequately defend and be, at the same time, struggle with balancing between maybe they might turn that around on us? And the founding fathers were hugely concerned with this. And if you read the Constitution, you start to think maybe they overdid it a little bit even. And this is an article from The Onion. If you think about all the organizations out there that protect the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, well, you don't really have any to even worry about the Third Amendment. I mean, it's just almost taken for granted that that's not going to ever be a problem. And up until World War II, the way they would generally deal with this potential threat was after a major war, they would just decimate the military. They just make it much, much smaller, and people's ranks would go from being a brigadier general to now you're a captain, and they keep the military very, very small. And that happened up until after World War II, when the Cold War happened. I've looked at, as I taught this class, I looked at the sort of veteran involvement in politics, which tracks very closely to military civic engagement, almost identically. And I look at 3 basic waves. The first wave is sort of at the founding of the country. I think of George Washington being sort of the model of that, the ideal, who goes off and defends the country and wins the Revolutionary War, and then is willing to just go home, and then becomes called to serve again, serves as president, and then after 2 terms says, I'm going to go and give up power, which set the tone for everybody else. But what's interesting about this time, that warfare at the time wasn't as technical as it is today. So you had a lot more folks who who were aristocrats, sort of, they come in and they'd lead during a war, and then they might go back to something else they were doing. And the same kind of people who would be generals with the kind of people who would be presidential aspirants. In fact, as you see, it goes up sort of up until after the Civil War. But at the beginning of the Civil War, only one West Pointer was a general. It was McClellan, and by the end, it was almost everybody had gone to West Point because it was becomes more of a technical enterprise making war. So funny, McClellan was also the candidate against Lincoln, as we all know. And what's interesting is there was a feeling at the time that perhaps he would be able to garner a lot of the soldiers' votes. Lincoln didn't think so, and he, in fact, made major lobbying efforts to make sure that there were either absentee ballots or furloughs for all the soldiers he had fighting around the Civil War. And especially in some of the swing states, he was very strategic about it, and made sure that the generals in charge would give them either time off or an absentee ballot where state allowed. And studies, actually, one of my students did a study about this too, but the research shows that Lincoln won 78% of the soldiers' vote, which was a little surprising given they were running against the former general. But it just kind of showed that this whole idea of Caesar coming across the Rubicon was not really a major threat for the U.S. And I guess the point here is that, as General Washington once said, when we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. And a big part of what we're all taught about today and what I do is about you need to make sure, it's obvious we need to keep the military apolitical, but that does not mean you have to be not politically or civically engaged. That's sort of the balance I think that you strike. Anyway, in wave one, I just want to tell another quick story to you about how there is actually a threat here, even if it's not of Caesar coming across the Rubicon, there is a threat of impropriety when the military gets too involved in politics. General Winfield Scott, he had an interesting situation where he was fighting for the nomination in 1852 against the president, who was Millard Fillmore, and Secretary of State, who's Henry Clay. Just pull a little Rubio there. Now, what's interesting is he had actually previously relocated his headquarters from D.C. to New York to get away from President Polk. But he moved it back when the election was coming up to D.C. He could actually do this back then. And then at the time, electioneering was not, especially primaries, were not what they are today. It was sort of a backroom deal. And so when Clay's and Fillmore's supporters couldn't really agree on who was going to be nominated for the Whigs, they decided to end up in a consensus candidate, which was Winfield Scott. And so he ends up running against Franklin Pierce in the general election. Now, interestingly, they'd actually been fighting together during the Mexican-American War, and Franklin Pierce being a brigadier general under General Winfield Scott. And at the Battle of Contreras, Pierce's horse fell and tripped and sort of ended up on top of Pierce and caused him an excruciating leg injury, which he could barely recover from. The next day, there was another battle, and Winfield Scott himself actually ordered him to the rear. And he protested and said, for God's sake, General, this is the last battle of the war. I need to be there with leading my brigade. And he relented and let him ride his horse into battle. He tied himself down to his saddle, at which point he began running into the battle and didn't fall off his horse, but he did faint from the excruciating pain in his leg. So later on, you see this political cartoon up here. It's basically Winfield Scott riding his gamecock and Franklin Pierce on a goose and saying, oh, I feel faint. They would make fun of Franklin Pierce for having fainted during battle while Winfield Scott was in charge. And it was, you might think of it as an early form of swift boating. But even more improper, the really improper part of this was from a standpoint of keeping the military apolitical. Fillmore, having lost the nomination battle, was still a loyal Whig. And so what he did is he realized that Scott needed to shore up some of his support in a bunch of different states. So he sent Scott on a mission to a bunch of different states to look for soldiers' asylums, what we might now call VA hospitals. Find suitable sites for a soldier's asylum, and they happened to be in a bunch of states where he needed to shore up support, especially among Germans and Irish. And whenever he'd go there, the Whigs would have a reception so they get to meet in glad hand, and it was one of the first times that a presidential candidate had actually gone and solicited votes in person. So after the resounding defeat of Winfield Scott by Pierce, he didn't faint on the campaign trail. He ends up Winfield Scott ends up taking his headquarters again and moving out of D.C. and going back to New York. And so this entire story, again, it's hard to believe that this could have happened in this country, this kind of thing would happen. And you can imagine what would happen today if, General Petraeus had decided, I'm just going to move my command to a different place because I'm running for president and while I'm actually on active duty. You can see how this isn't a situation we really want to have either. And Wave 2 sort of comes in the wake of the Civil War. I mean, it happens afterwards, but it really is sort of the shadow of the Civil War. We have Grant becoming president, and everyone says he's a great general, not such a great president. And William Tecumseh Sherman, who was asked to run, and he said, if drafted, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. And basically took the military and really made it a little bit more of a more closed off and less civically engaged for a while. And you see that from 1901 to 1948, you have very few veterans who are nominated for president or were nominated for president, and included 5 consecutive elections without a single vet. And you look at Teddy Roosevelt, and he's almost a throwback to that earlier time when you had more aristocratic people sort of coming in and taking the hill, and then the Rough Riders, and then coming back. So a lot of that, even after World War II, this was happening, and a lot of it, I think, was just a kind of an insular mentality in the military. It wasn't as civically engaged as it had been earlier. And it's in that time period that we have the issue with Camp Marfa and the officers' wives. And I read this exactly, but General Truscott later recounted the situation, saying, officers stationed in Marfa during this little political storm learned thoroughly that it was not well for the military to undertake to influence the selection of candidates for political office. So that was sort of the mentality at the time. After World War II, we sort of have a third wave. And I think of General Eisenhower as sort of being the exemplar of that. If you think of Winfield Scott as being too political in the military, and you think of Sherman as being not civically engaged enough, Eisenhower might be a good sort of middle ground there. Sort of transcended politics. Was not beholden to either party, and was able to sort of, somewhat the way the military is seen today is being above political maneuvering. And then up until 92, every single major party's nominee had some type of military experience, with only one exception. So the question now, and this is sort of where I wanted to get to after what Matt was talking about, is are we entering a new era? We've just had a first presidential election without a single veteran serving, and I don't necessarily think that we are. I think that we've sort of come down. We've seen these slides, but here's something interesting. So as the decline in vets in Congress has happened, there's also been a corresponding decline in the confidence of Congress. And I don't think that's because, right? So while the military's been going the other way, and I don't think this is because, voters around the country are clamoring for more veterans in office, but I do think that there was something about shared military service, especially in World War II, that transcended partisanship. And there are so few things that still transcend partisanship in this city. And that is, I think, a big part of why there's not the same camaraderie there was across party lines as there was a few years ago when there were a lot more veterans there. And if that doesn't convince you, we all know about democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies are less likely to fight one another. An academic at Duke, Peter Feaver, did a study recently where he ran the numbers and found out that military experience in the elite, that's Congress, presidency, the administration, has a greater effect on ensuring that the country is peaceful than whether other countries are democratic. So that's just another one I'll throw in there. Anyway, so all that together is why I'm doing what I'm doing here, what we're doing at this university. And I'll tell you a little bit about the center for a sec. We, as I mentioned, are about 4 years old and are trying to get veterans more civically engaged. We have what's called a Second Service Fellowship, which is for graduate student veterans who are interested in running for office, working on campaigns, working in legislative affairs, and go to our graduate school of political management. We have a semester in Washington for student veterans who are from around the country. They come for a semester and they learn about politics, especially, and what available opportunities there are for them in D.C. We really started as this whole thing called the Veterans Campaign Workshops, which were candidate training programs for veterans. Excuse me. And lastly, we have a distinguished speaker series, which you're actually about to see right now when I introduce Peter. Basically, the idea is that we bring in a bunch of folks who have made a transition from the military to politics in some form or other. Generally speaking, they're members of Congress or the Senate, often appointees. Tonight we have the executive director of the American Legion's Washington office. So, just to sum up, I think in a lot of ways as we move forward, try to get more veterans civically engaged, and as I said, it really begins with voting. I mean, that's a big part of fulfilling your civic duty. I think of the greatest generation, what made them great, and the things I think about are, they were obviously committed to service. What they did was, there's no way to overstate that. But they were also civically engaged. Unlike some other previous generations who got, fed up with politics and so forth, they really wanted to stay engaged. But they're also well educated, and that sort of brings me to my next point. There's FDR signing the GI Bill right there, and interestingly, the GI Bill, was a big part of a lot of these titans of politics that served in World War II and then went on to be great senators and so forth had really begun their career with the GI Bill. And the very first GI Bill recipient went to school right here at GW. His name was Don Balfour. And this has been a long-standing mission of this university. So in just the way that that you and your organization is helping to get more veterans civically engaged or military civically engaged when they're overseas, which is a big part of it. The educational aspect of it is something that we're working very hard at here at GW. GW Valor is a new program. It's about a little less than a year old. Veterans Accelerate Learning Opportunities and Rewards. And just a few months ago now, almost a year, the university brought in Vice Admiral Mel Williams to run it. He's the Associate Provost for Military and Veterans Affairs. Are you here right now, sir? Is that I can barely see through the, there he is right there. And the idea here is to make the quality learning that we have at this university more affordable and available to veterans and tailor it to what they need. Some of the things that we're doing beyond second service, I mean, it's really growing a lot from here. This is one part of a larger project. But we're expanding learning opportunities in Hampton Roads, Virginia. We're putting a lot more online programs for undergrad and graduates, so that if you're in the military and you're deployed overseas, you have a chance to do to finish up your degree. Maybe you've gotten some classes done. You have a couple choices. I mean, you have sometimes you have some for-profit universities who are constantly sending you stuff to kind of get your tuition money, get your GI Bill money, but you also have an opportunity to get a degree at George Washington University, which obviously will be a much more helpful piece of wall art at the end of your degree. And we're also working on making GW extensions available on military bases. So if you're stationed somewhere in Fort Belvoir or down toward Norfolk, that you have the chance to actually get in-person instruction, and we're bringing instruction to you instead of you having to commute all the way up to D.C., which, as you've probably noticed this morning, can be a real pain. That is the end of my talk. Again, I just want to sum up. My whole point here is to say that it's really important that the military does stay apolitical and nonpartisan, but it does not mean that it can't be politically engaged and civically engaged. And in fact, when you look at history, we've done such great things when our military has been engaged in that way, and I think it does actually help with our ensuring that Caesar does not cross the Rubicon, or that we don't have to worry about the Third Amendment and quartering of soldiers and silly things like that. But it really does bring a lot of fantastic people to this city, where I think they're needed more than ever right now. And on the note of the GI Bill, I want to introduce Peter Gaytan, who is the Executive Director of the American Legion's Washington, D.C. office. The Legion was a huge part of bringing the GI Bill on originally, and the new GI Bill as well. And it's the largest veterans organization. Peter's been the executive director there for 5 years. Has been with them for 15. He's another political science graduate, he's just told me, who came to D.C. thinking he might know about politics and learned very quickly that he didn't, but has learned so much over time, and now he's running the legislative efforts for the largest veterans organization in the country. And something, a cool fun fact, I'm just going to keep plugging my students here, but another one of my students did a study of where the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans were, what organizations they were joining. And the Legion doesn't really publish this a lot, but they have close to 250,000 of their 2.4 million members are Iraq, Afghanistan veterans. So it's a huge group that's doing a lot of good for a lot of folks. And I just want to welcome Peter Gaytan.
Well, thanks, Seth, and thank all of you for that warm welcome. I want to just add on to some of the things that Seth had mentioned, not only about the American Legion, but about the Center for Second Service and how amazing that idea is that Seth had, and how productive they are at helping those veterans who understand what it means to commit to service, to continue that service. Those veterans who've been touched by their experience in uniform and how they want to continue to serve their community and our nation. The American Legion is proud to support Veterans Campaign, and we appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with Seth and his staff on the Center's mission to assist those veterans who are seeking to continue their service to our great nation through public service as civilians. Seth's vision to create the Veterans Campaign is very commendable. It's important that veterans who feel compelled to continue to serve are provided the assistance they need to successfully integrate the political structure. The Legion commends you, Seth, and your efforts to assist the best and brightest of America's veterans. Also, I want to express the Legion's support for the mission of the Overseas Vote Foundation and the U.S. Vote Foundation. The Legion has a proud history of advocacy in ensuring that our election process is fair and just, especially for our service members. It's important that all men and women in uniform are afforded the opportunity to cast their ballots and be accounted for, even if they are stationed overseas or on deployment far from home. It's been a pleasure meeting and speaking with the fellows at the Center earlier tonight, and for those of you whom I have yet to meet, I am Peter Gaytan. I'm the Executive Director of the American Legion National Headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Prior to beginning my career as a military and veterans advocate here in D.C., I was active duty Air Force at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. During my time at Dover as a young enlisted troop, I was privileged to serve on the Honor Guard and to augment the staff at the port mortuary there. Dover is home to the military's largest port mortuary, and any military or family member who dies overseas comes through Dover Air Force Base and is processed through the mortuary before taking that final journey home. It was there, as a 23-year-old senior airman, that I personally truly learned the meaning of service. I helped to bring home the remains of 18 Army Rangers killed in Somalia during the Battle of Mogadishu, or as we all know now, Black Hawk Down. Draping the U.S. flag over the transfer cases of our fallen heroes and ensuring that their remains are safely transported home for final honors definitely instills an appreciation for not only your own mortality, but the value of being part of something bigger than yourself. The military experience can galvanize a person's commitment to service, and I'm just lucky that I've been able to continue that service as the Executive Director of America's largest veteran service organization, the American Legion. I'm now on the front lines in the battle to secure and protect the earned benefits of our nation's veterans. And I'm lucky enough to have the strength of an organization that will be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2019. And I'm lucky enough to have the strength of 2.4 million members of the greatest veteran service organization in the world when fighting to protect retiree compensation, or reduce the VA disability claims backlog, or urge better communication between DoD and VA to ensure effective claims processing. We also urge better communication between DoD and VA to ensure effective identification, diagnosis, and treatment of TBI and PTSD. Through the American Legion, I'm able to continue to serve, and I'm truly grateful. The American Legion has a certain image that most Americans have. You think of the American Legion, you may think of the funny cap and old guys waving flags, or that local post down the street that may have a bar, may be smoky. And the struggle that we have, and I guess I shouldn't characterize it as a struggle. That image of the American Legion is not something to push away or to fear. That image of the American Legion is the foundation of our organization. And the battle that we fight now is to remain relevant. But we can remain relevant by standing on that foundation of that organization that is defined by those old guys in funny hats, because those old guys in funny hats given us the opportunity to do the things that we've done here. The battles they fought did create the GI Bill, the original Service Members Readjustment Act of 1944. Seth mentioned that, and that has been called the greatest single piece of legislation in American history. The GI Bill that the American Legion fought to pass created middle-class America. It gave returning service members the opportunity to raise a family, to purchase a home, to start a business, to become employed. That created the infrastructure of our great nation today. And that's due to the sacrifices that they gave while wearing the uniform overseas to protect us. But we as a nation back then recognized the need to ensure that when they returned, they were taken care of. That when they returned, we didn't turn their backs on them, that we understood the sacrifices that they've been through. And we understood as a nation that we owe them. That we owe them for the sacrifices they've made and the security they've given us and our families so we can raise our children. The American Legion is strong in this nation, for this nation, not just for veterans issues or for military issues, but for our nation as a whole. Aside from the GI Bill, the issues we now face are to welcome back the newest generation of veterans. And we're doing that every day by fighting to ensure that Congress doesn't cut the cost of living increases for military retirees. If you're unaware, Congress right now is looking at the entire federal budget and saying we need to cut some costs. So they're targeting the smallest percentage of Americans, those military retirees who have earned this benefit. They haven't asked for a handout. They've earned this through their service to this country, 20 years or more. They've worn the uniform to protect us. But our Congress is saying, let's take away their increases in their retirement pay to help reduce the budget. That's ridiculous, and the American Legion won't stand for it. We're fighting those battles. We're continuing to fight those battles every day. We want to ensure that this new era of veterans coming back who are suffering from the signature wounds of this war and from Iraq with PTSD and TBI, that DOD and VA are able to collaborate to ensure that that transition is smooth, that VA can communicate with DOD. It can ensure that we have accurate diagnosis and treatment for PTSD and TBI. So the organization that is often associated with smoky bar rooms and old war stories and flags waving and funny hats, and I have my hat here, I just chose not to wear it this evening. But I did that on purpose. I didn't want to give you an image of an organization that you already have a preconceived notion of. And when I say that, again, it's not that we need to ignore the history of this great organization or the men and women who built that foundation and built the GI Bill and provided for our nation and go to those spaghetti dinners and go to those fundraisers. We're going to stand on that foundation. We're going to reach towards the future. We're going to say, what can we continue to do as a service organization for veterans that will carry this nation into the future? So we're not neglecting our veterans and those men and women who serve. Like Seth said, we have smaller numbers of members of Congress who even understand what it's like to wear the uniform. We as a nation, our society may not be as affected directly by military members. We might not have an uncle, a son, a cousin, a sister, a daughter who's serving in the military. But I tell you what, it's our obligation as every citizen in this nation to understand the sacrifices that they paid. And it's our obligation as citizens and as a nation to make sure that we don't forget that. And the American Legion... And I take seriously my role as executive director of the American Legion here in Washington, D.C., to not only carry forth the messages that are defined by the 2.4 million members that comprise our great organization, but it's important that we continue to carry that message. And we're doing that every day. And I do want to thank Seth again for even reaching out to the American Legion, getting through that image, and giving us an opportunity to move forward. And I explained earlier when we had our session with the fellows earlier that I have seen within the organization of the American Legion a real awakening. Those Vietnam veterans who struggled to get the power away from the World War II veterans within the service organizations realized that they don't want to cause that same struggle for the newest generation of veterans. The Vietnam veterans are ready to assist this new era of veterans. It gives them a sense of accomplishment. For them to say, what happened to us, we won't allow to happen to you. And they've opened the door within our organization to allow the newer generation to address the needs. They say, we're here for you, but you guys lead us. Stand on the foundation of this organization. Show us where we need to go next. And opportunities like this and collaborating with great organizations like Student Veterans of America, with the Center for Second Service, this is how we become relevant in the future without neglecting our past and ignoring what brought us to where we are today. So it's exciting to be here and part of this evening, and I thank you, Seth. And I'm also proud of the staff of our organization who are part of the Center for Second Service. We have staff who are here and are studying to do more because they understand that commitment to service. They remember what it was like to wear the uniform and be part of something that's bigger than themselves. And they've taken that uniform off, but they've continued that commitment to service. And that goes back to what Seth was talking about. I really like that graph. Confidence going up, reality going down, but the veterans are still there, and we will be there. And Seth, you and your fellows clearly understand the importance of being part of something bigger than yourselves. The fact that you each are challenging yourselves to not only pursue higher education, but focus on an outcome that will provide an opportunity for you to continue to serve in the highest levels of government illustrates your undying commitment to service. For each of you to commit yourselves to a new mission, a mission that carries on the tradition of service that you came to value during your time in uniform, will benefit the nation as a whole. And honestly, for you to pursue a future in politics in today's environment here in Washington is extremely admirable. I personally admire each of you for what you're doing and what you aspire to achieve. And with Seth's forward thinking and admirable vision in the creation of the Veterans Campaign and the Center for Second Service, it's inevitable that our nation will benefit from your continued service. Today, more than ever, our nation needs individuals like America's veterans, like Seth, like the fellows, like my staff, like the men and women that you see waving those flags and wearing those funny hats. I think there's a time for our nation to return back to those core values that we seem to neglect. When entertainers at the Grammys reach the front page and the fact that Congress is cutting retiree benefits is nowhere to be seen reflects poorly on our nation. We need more individuals who understand that meaning of sacrifice, who understand what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves, like I've said. We need more heroes, like each of you, who feel strongly enough to seek out opportunities that will allow you to continue your strong commitment to service. And I pledge to you that the American Legion stands ready to join in ensuring that we all work together to cultivate this new era of veterans and not forget the tradition, those men and women, our uncles, our grandfathers, our neighbors. The guy in front of you at the grocery store is taking too long and you're frustrated about it. Well, he may have liberated a concentration camp, and we owe him the respect that he deserves. So I commit to you that the American Legion will still be here, will still be doing good things for our country, and together we can work to show this new era of veterans the thanks of a grateful nation, the true thanks of a grateful nation, and that is not to forget their sacrifices and to ensure that we provide a voice strong enough to show that what they've sacrificed for us will not be forgotten, because we will ensure that Congress will not cut the benefits that they've earned through their service to this country. So thank you very much, and thank you, Seth, again, for including the American Legion.
Well, we're getting towards the end, but I now have what I think is the best job of Summit. Each year, OVF awards certificates of merit for meritorious service to those people who have helped overseas citizens and military to be able to vote and have those votes counted. We really don't want anybody to say, I didn't really care or worry about voting because I knew it wouldn't count. And we're going to recognize today 3 people who have made considerable contributions to making that happen. These are people who are behind the scenes. They're not necessarily people that you have seen in some of the roles that might have seen before. I want to kind of set the tone for that by quoting Ambassador Dwight Murrow, who was a partner of J.P. Morgan prior to the Second World War and was named the ambassador to Mexico. And he had a son graduating from college in, I think, 1938, if I remember. And he felt compelled to write some words to his son that would help guide his life going forward. And he said something along the following lines: "My son, as you go into your life you're going to find that the world is divided into two kinds of people. Those who try to take credit for what's happened, and those who actually make it happen. My advice to you, my son, is to be in that second category. There's far less competition. Today we're recognizing 3 people who fit into that category. The first recipient of our award for meritorious service is Scott Weedman from the FVAP. Scott, if you come forward, I'll just say a few more words, and then we'll give you a chance to respond. Scott has completed more than 20 years service at FVAP. He's done an awful lot of jobs, and we've seen him in many different roles. He served under 4 directors, starting with Polly Brunelli, and the current director we had the pleasure of hearing now. Personally, I see Scott as kind of the face of FVAP, because since I've been involved in this, Scott's been a constant, and I applaud you for what you've been able to do. I have only one small concern about presenting this to you, and that is I'm told that you don't get rid of anything, and I'm afraid it's going to get lost in your office. But let that go, and we'll certainly be happy to give you the opportunity to do this. I think it's noteworthy how much you've done with military, with the voting assistance officers, with the State Department, with civic organizations like OVF, and all of the other people, election officials that you worked with. So we commend you for this, and we thank you for your service to UOCAVA voters.
Great, thank you very much.
If you want to say anything, please go ahead.
It's always been an honor and a privilege to serve those that serve us, and I can't say it any better than the last couple of presenters have done, but it's a great honor to be here, and this is my 8th summit with OVF as well, so it's been a pleasure to be at all the summits and enjoyed all the candor and the discussion that's gone on, and really move forward the discussion and a lot of progress to help the military and overseas voters. So thank you so much.
Thank you again. No, that's fine. That's fine. The next recipient of an award is, well, internally, I've decided that these awards should be called the Susans. You know, we have the world of Oscars and Emmys and Cleos. We refer to these as the Susans, even if she doesn't choose to acknowledge it. Well, the next recipient of a Susan is to recognize one of our own, our Chief Financial Officer and a Director, Richard Vogt. If Richard would come forward, we'd really like to be able to honor him. Let me say a few words. Yeah. I just want to say a few words and make Richard embarrassed before we go along with this. Richard was first associated with OVF when, as a trailing spouse, he moved to Bavaria because his wife worked for BMW, which had a plant in South Carolina, which is where, not Richard's from Massachusetts, but he was living in South Carolina. Pardon? No, south. Yeah, south. He became a UOCAVA voter. He was financially literate, and he became, at first, our external auditor, but quickly we realized that there was so much more that he could do for us that he became our CFO and a member of the board of directors. Richard went beyond the call of duty because his wife was transferred again, and transferred to China. So Richard was always the odd man out when we were having phone calls, because he was getting up at some ungodly hour that the rest of us would not have done so, but he was so loyal and so helpful to us that we really want to recognize you for all of the contributions that you've made to OVF, and we look forward to many more years of collaboration with you. So, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Denise, no.
No. Let me just finish. I want to
Okay.
not tell who the other one is.
I have a hard time not telling stories about Richard.
Well, no, you may. You may. We have a third nominee who can't be with us tonight because of schedule, but it is the OVF Pro Bono Council who adopted OVF in 2005. His name is Barry Hart, and his firm is Winston & Strawn, where some of you may have visited OVF functions in the Winston & Strawn office on K Street. Barry certainly is one of those people who took Dwight Murrow's advice to his son, because Barry's the kind of person that makes things happen. Barry's firm has been so good to us. They taught us, well, first they helped us get a 501c3 status. And then they kind of took Susan and me and some others under their wing and taught us how Washington works, or whatever, how it kind of works. They even helped us chase an earmark. That was quite an episode in our history. And finally, they've helped us with so many things like the licensing agreement for the software that we share with a number of states and counties and other organizations. So we will present Barry with his award tomorrow at Winston, because the second half of the E2E is going to be at Winston tomorrow, and we will be able to give Barry his award at that point in time. So thank you very much for giving me this chance to recognize at least two of our behind-the-scenes warriors. Thank you.
I could hardly resist getting up here and telling some stories about Richard, but I realized it's getting late, and those stories probably are better told with a drink in your hand. And that's waiting for you. So I'd like to first thank all of you for being here today. You braved the cold. There were so many incredible, fluid, dynamic changes. I hope you didn't even realize that we adjusted the agenda a bit, but thank you for hanging in there with us with some of that. It's been a great day. Every summit is wonderful, and we learned so much. We can carry this forward into our next hour at the reception. All you have to do is go out this door on this side, take a left, and it's one door down. Well, you'll see us all there. Very long building. You can't miss it. I can't remember exactly the address, but don't cross any streets, okay? And don't cross any afterward either. So thank you again, all of you. Hope to see you here next year.